Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord and Savior Jesus the Christ. This is Kevin Shively, lead pastor of St. Matthew Lutheran Church in York, Pennsylvania, and I welcome you to this week's edition of Preaching Points, if you will, a brief video Bible study on the preaching text for this upcoming Sunday. And this video study is for Sunday, August the 30th, the 13th Sunday after Pentecost. And the text is from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 16. We begin at verse 21. Matthew 16, 21 to 28. And I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you. But Jesus turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Then Jesus told his disciples, If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world, but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. When I was in high school, I had a basketball coach. Now, understand, I am no basketball player. I love basketball. I especially like to watch high school and college basketball. It's a fun game, but I'm pretty bad at it. But because I love basketball so much, I was a basketball manager at West York High School for grades 8 all the way through grade 12 when I graduated. And the head basketball coach at the time was a mentor, a school teacher, John Eister. And one of the things that he said on many occasions is this. You know, Kevin, he said, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I couldn't help but think about that as I looked at this text for this week. And again, a major focus of this text is, of course, on Peter, the one who is, in the 1 minute by Jesus, proclaimed as the rock on which Jesus will build the church of God. And in the next minute almost, we hear Jesus rebuking Peter in this text, calling him a stumbling block for the fellow believers, getting in the way of God. What a reversal of the relationship that was going on between Jesus and Peter, just that quick. It does beg the question, as one commentator I looked at posed on many occasions, and that was, can you imagine what Jesus is talking about here when he talks about his suffering and his death and his resurrection, and that this was necessary? Can you imagine? Evidently, Peter couldn't imagine. He couldn't imagine that Jesus had come not simply to comfort people, but to free people. Well, what's the difference? Well, comforting is kind of easy. You give people a little bit more of what they have, and you tell them it's going to be okay or all right. That is a way to comfort people. Freedom is much more challenging and much deeper. Freedom would require that you and I would see that what we have, or what we focus on, or what we prioritize isn't all that life-giving in the first place. Now, don't get me wrong. Peter certainly proclaims Jesus and declares Jesus to be the Messiah. But when Peter did that, he was really expressing the expectations and understandings of the day in which he lived, of the people. And I'm not so sure he wasn't kind of talking about how we see things even now. What did Peter envision when he talked about Jesus being the Messiah? Well, another King David, a warrior-like king, a person of power and might who will drive out the Romans and free the Israelites from the domination and oppression of the Roman Empire. Now, this understanding, of course, is understandable, and it's reasonable. The Romans were foreign occupiers. They imposed ruthless Roman law and imposed devastating taxes, and those who didn't toe the line and didn't pay were greeted with violence and other sad things. The problem, if you will, is that this expectation of Jesus as this promised Messiah who's a warrior king who would come and get rid of the Romans is a great thing, but in the big picture, what does it change? What would be different? All it would change is who's in charge of what's going on. But the rotating wheel of force and violence would keep on revolving if Jesus was merely this warrior king Messiah, like King David, that so many had hoped for. Jesus knows this. He knows that he comes into this story from a very different perspective with a very different logic. And Jesus's logic, if you will, his purpose, his power, if you will, is in mercy and forgiveness and love rather than retribution and violence and hate. Jesus's perspective of mercy, forgiveness, and love challenges the powers that be. It threatens them because Jesus is speaking truth to power. And Jesus knows that these powers that be, these political and military and religious powers and authorities, won't tolerate his obstruction. They will try to run Jesus over. And Peter can't imagine that either. He just can't see it. As strange as this might sound, my brothers and sisters, is it any wonder that Jesus was killed? I mean, think about it. From the day he was born, Herod set out to get rid of him. Herod the king. He ordered the slaughter of all toddler infant boys under the age of 2, I think it is, to try to eliminate Jesus. This is referred to in present liturgical parlance as the slaughter of the holy innocents. So the fact that Jesus was killed or crucified for preaching his message of forgiveness and love and mercy isn't surprising. He was a threat. Where's the surprise? What's different? It's that the difference is, the surprise is that Jesus was raised from the dead. And Jesus' resurrection reinforces, in fact, it establishes that Jesus' life and his love and his mercy and his forgiveness, these things will ultimately be that which will prevail over the powers of darkness and violence and evil. It's hard to imagine. I mean, you and I, we look around our lives, it's hard to see where right's going to prevail and wrong's going to be defeated, because that's not what we tend to see day in and day out. This is hard for us to imagine, but this is what Jesus invites us to. This is what Jesus was inviting Peter and his disciples into. A life that is shaped by love and forgiveness. A life that is filled with actions that are shaped by compassion and hope and loving kindness and concern. Like Peter, often what we really want is a little more of what the world already offers us. Think about it. That's what we tend to want more of. Force, security, wealth, status, popularity, whatever. But I remind you, Jesus came into the world as the Savior of the world, not to comfort us with more, but to free us from that which is not life-giving. And freedom first means realizing that perhaps we've settled for some things that aren't life-giving. So, we can hear God's promise of life, a promise that means something to us maybe only after what we've previously attested or accepted as life and life-giving, only after that stuff dies or is pushed aside. Look, we know. You and I know, we know that people are dying. We know that the world has disappointed us. We know that we have settled for less than what God hopes for us. We know this. The evidence is all around us. There's disappointing relationships and illnesses that return, and a pandemic that doesn't want to end, and careers that changed, and jobs that are being lost, and schools that can't open, and kids that don't know what to do, and the untimely death of loved ones, and mourning, and disappointment looming around every corner, and loss of control, and on I could go. But we know all this stuff is going on. We live it. We're living it every day. We're feeling it. We're trying to get through it. So maybe we need to ask. Maybe we need to ask ourselves if we're ready for something different, something more. Maybe we need to talk about that and to try to imagine the life that Jesus promises. And that can be difficult, because that would mean giving somebody else another chance instead of writing them off, or forgiving someone who's wronged us instead of seeking revenge or retribution. It could mean being open-handed and generous with the resources we've been blessed with, rather than holding on to whatever we can. It could mean offering our future to God rather than planning each step of the way. It could be seeking joy in service rather than acquiring more stuff. It could be all these things, but it could be hard Because like I said before, you and I, we've tended to accept that which the world offers as life-giving. And really it isn't. But maybe we can begin to think about it. Maybe we can see that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And what stays the same is God's mercy and grace, God's love and acceptance, God's call to you and me, God's desire that we look and see if we can see that God is at work. And that even in our midst, God is finding ways to give us a taste of a life that we never thought possible. And multiplying our good deeds and actions for others far beyond we might ever have dreamed or imagined. Until suddenly, just as it felt like we'd lost our lives, that instead we find them. So I leave you with that thought. Can you imagine what God is up to in your life, in my life, in our congregational life, in our community, and in our world? The more things change, the more they stay the same. And Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. May God's peace be yours.